The stuntman didn't stumble. He didn't fall. He flew, 10 feet through the air, backward, arms spread wide like he'd been hit by a car, before crashing into a crowd of extras who had absolutely no idea what was coming. The reinforced shield he was holding, the same kind of thick, padded armor designed to absorb the full swing of a baseball bat, had cracked clean in half. His arm snapped on impact. And the man responsible wasn't even trying. Bruce Lee immediately rushed over, apologizing, genuinely horrified at what he'd accidentally done. But one man on that set didn't move. He just stood there, staring at the broken shield. His name was John Saxon. He was a black belt. He had spent years taking real hits from real fighters in real dojos. And in that moment, staring at a cracked pad and a broken arm, he realized something that would haunt him for the next 47 years. What would have happened if there was no shield? Here's what almost nobody knows. John Saxon didn't just act in Enter the Dragon. He analyzed it. And what he witnessed, and kept silent about for nearly 4 decades, is the most credible, technically literate testimony Bruce Lee's power has ever received. This is that story. There's no shortage of Bruce Lee mythology. Fans have argued about it since 1973. Movie magic, camera tricks, accelerated film speed. The debunkers have had a field day for 50 years. But here's the thing about John Saxon that separates him from every other witness. He wasn't a fan. He wasn't a filmmaker. He wasn't trying to build a legend or sell merchandise. He was a trained fighter with a black belt in Shotokan karate under one of the most demanding masters in American history. A man who had earned his rank the hard way, with bleeding knuckles and shaking legs and years of brutal, unpadded sparring. When John Saxon watched Bruce Lee move, he wasn't watching with awe. He was watching with analysis. And what he described in private interviews, in rare convention appearances, in the final years before his death in 2020, was not the mythology you've been sold. It was something stranger. Something that went beyond speed, beyond strength, beyond anything that Saxon, even with all of his training, could fully explain. We're going to walk through every account Saxon left behind, starting from the very beginning, from Brooklyn to Bel Air. From a private gym in 1972 to a broken shield on a Hong Kong set in 1973. Stay with me, because the moment that changes everything doesn't come when you expect it. Before we can understand what Saxon witnessed, you have to understand who John Saxon actually was. Not the Hollywood version, the real one. He was born Carmine Rico in 1936 in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn, a neighborhood that in the Depression era operated by rules that no studio could replicate. His parents were Italian-American working class. The world he grew up in wasn't defined by ambition. It was defined by survival. Young Carmine didn't take his first fighting lesson in a dojo. He took it in an alley because showing fear in Bay Ridge had consequences. He developed something that formal training rarely produces and almost never destroys: an intuitive reading of aggression, a sensitivity to the moment before violence erupts. He carried that with him his entire life. At 16, a modeling agent spotted him skipping school. His face, brooding, angular, intense, landed him on the covers of detective magazines before he ever stepped in front of a movie camera. Hollywood came calling fast. The legendary agent Henry Wilson, the same man who manufactured Rock Hudson, took Carmine under his wing. And like every other project Wilson touched, the first thing that changed was the name. Carmine Rico became John Saxon. But unlike the other beefcake stars Wilson groomed, men content to smile on cue and let the studio machinery carry them, Saxon refused the mold. He enrolled at the Stella Adler Conservatory of Acting, the same institution that had trained Marlon Brando. He didn't want to perform. He wanted to understand. And then, in the late 1950s, he walked into a dojo. Not because it was trendy. Martial arts in America in 1958 was about as mainstream as competitive chess. He walked in because something in the discipline called to the Brooklyn kid who had spent his whole life learning that the world only respects what it fears. The man he found there was Hidetaka Nishiyama, a titan of Shotokan karate who had trained under the legendary Gichin Funakoshi himself, the man who brought karate from Okinawa to the Japanese mainland. Nishiyama wasn't interested in Hollywood. He wasn't interested in stars. In his dojo, a movie credit meant nothing. What mattered was whether you could endure. And his sessions were designed to answer that question with absolute brutality. Hours of horse stance until the legs became something that felt separate from the body, trembling, screaming, beyond the point where the mind could negotiate with them. Hundreds of punches against makiwara boards until the knuckles split open. Full contact sparring with no weight classes, no padding, no mercy extended for someone's day job. Saxon didn't quit. He found, and this is something he said more than once in interviews, a strange peace in the pain. A clarity that the chaos of Hollywood could never provide. He earned a legitimate black belt under Nishiyama. Then he earned a black belt in judo. And by the time Enter the Dragon came looking for him, John Saxon wasn't auditioning as a martial arts actor. He was a martial artist who also happened to act. Which is exactly why what he saw in Bruce Lee's private gym shook him to the core of everything he thought he knew about combat. The year was 1972. Warner Brothers had greenlit a co-production with Golden Harvest Studios in Hong Kong. The film needed a Western face, someone audiences in America and Europe could anchor to. John Saxon was the name that came up. When it reached Bruce Lee, his reaction was skepticism. Bruce Lee famously had zero patience for fakes. His radar for incompetence was calibrated to a frequency most people never even detected. He had spent years fighting the assumption that Chinese martial arts were theatrical, decorative, and fundamentally unserious. The last thing he wanted in the film that was supposed to change that perception was a Hollywood actor who moved like a Hollywood actor. So he didn't wait for a casting tape. He invited Saxon to his home in Bel Air for what was billed, diplomatically, as a casual script reading. Saxon knew exactly what it was. He drove to the house in Bel Air prepared for a test. What he was not prepared for was the gym. Bruce Lee's private training space wasn't what people expected when they imagined a movie star's home gym. There were no mirrors, no chrome machines, no vanity equipment. Instead, the room looked like something a weapons designer had assembled for a very specific purpose. Custom-built heavy bags filled not with sand or foam, but with compressed metal shot, giving them a density that absorbed impact the way a real body would. Geometric wooden contraptions designed to train angles of attack that traditional dojos never considered. Walls lined with reference materials, biomechanics texts, anatomy diagrams, books in English and Chinese and Japanese. It was a laboratory, and Bruce Lee was its scientist. He asked Saxon simply to show him a sidekick. Saxon obliged. His kick was technically excellent, Shotokan and precise, snapped with the hip rotation Nishiyama had drilled into him across thousands of repetitions. It was the kind of kick that would have impressed anyone in the room. Bruce watched it in complete silence. Then he walked to the nearest heavy bag, the one packed with metal shot, weighing somewhere around 1,000 pounds of resistance, and without warning, without stretching, without a breath of preparation, he kicked it. Saxon said later that the sound was like a gunshot. Not the slap of a foot on leather. A crack. The sound of something structural being stressed past its design limit. The bag didn't swing. It folded. The bottom curved upward as the force traveled through it from the point of impact, and the top of the bag slammed against the ceiling with enough violence that plaster cracked overhead. Bruce turned back to Saxon, completely dry. Not a bead of sweat. Not an elevated breath. He said, "That is the difference between hitting a target and destroying it." Saxon stood there in silence. He was a trained fighter. He understood the mechanics of power generation. He knew about hip rotation, weight transfer, kinetic chain efficiency. He could have explained the physics of a powerful kick to a room full of students. What he could not explain, and what he said he spent years afterward trying to rationalize, was how a man of Bruce Lee's size produced that result. Bruce Lee, at his fighting weight, was approximately 135 pounds. The bag weighed more than 7 times that. When John Saxon arrived in Hong Kong in early 1973, he stepped into a world that operated by entirely different physics than Hollywood. The set of Enter the Dragon was not a controlled environment. It was a pressure system on the edge of rupture. You had legitimate martial arts grandmasters sharing space with local triad-affiliated extras. You had rival kung fu schools who felt Bruce was exposing secrets that were never meant to leave China. You had underground fighters looking for any opportunity to test themselves against the man whose name was starting to reach every corner of the world. Saxon noted something that he found deeply unsettling from the first day on set. Bruce Lee didn't move through that environment like a movie star. He moved like a man who had already calculated every thread in the room, already identified every exit, already determined the response to every scenario before it became a scenario. It wasn't paranoia. It was predator awareness. The same stillness before violence that Saxon had tried to develop in Nishiyama's dojo. But in Bruce, It was simply native. It wasn't a skill he had acquired. It was a frequency he operated on, and the set kept testing it. One afternoon during filming, a particular extra, a man with a real reputation in Hong Kong's underground fighting circuit, not a stuntman, not an actor, started mocking Bruce's kung fu. Loudly, deliberately, loud enough for the entire crew to stop what they were doing. In Hollywood, security handles it. In Hong Kong in 1973, in front of an audience of fighters who were measuring every response, security was not an option. This was a face situation, a dominance situation, the kind of confrontation that, in that world, had only two resolutions. The set went dead silent. Saxon was standing close enough to watch every detail. Bruce didn't raise his voice. He didn't square up. He simply walked toward the man and kept walking until he was close enough that the extra had to make a choice, hold his ground or step back. The extra held. Bruce's hands were at his sides. His posture was relaxed. His face was open. He was, in every visual signal available, completely inviting the first strike. The extra hesitated. That was the moment. Right there in the hesitation. Saxon recognized it instantly as a trained fighter. The moment when an opponent's internal calculation pauses because it has encountered something it cannot resolve. And in that split second of unresolved calculation, Bruce fainted. Not a full strike. A suggestion of one. A movement so fast and so committed in its initial acceleration that the extra's nervous system responded before his brain could process whether it was real. The extra flinched backward so violently that he tripped over his own feet and went down, without Bruce touching him, without a single point of contact. Saxon said afterward that it was the most terrifying thing he'd ever seen on a set. Not because of the violence, because of the absence of violence. Because Bruce had not only defeated the man, he had done it in a way that made the defeat total. The extra hadn't lost a fight. He had lost the argument about whether a fight was even necessary. His body had answered for him. Between takes, in the quiet hours when the production was resetting, Bruce and Saxon would spar. Saxon was clear about this in every retelling. He wasn't sandbagging. He wasn't holding back out of deference to the star. He was coming with everything he had. Every combination Nishiyama had drilled into him. Jabs, hooks, spinning kicks, body shots. The full vocabulary of a legitimate black belt who had earned his rank through years of real contact. He never landed a clean shot. Not once. Not in 10 minutes. Not in 20. And what made it stranger than a simple speed advantage was the nature of the failure. When you spar with someone faster than you feel the blocks. You feel the parries. You feel the counter coming. The physical conversation still exists. You just keep losing it. With Bruce, there was no conversation. Every time Saxon committed to a technique, the instant the decision was made in his nervous system to extend the punch or launch the kick, Bruce was already moving. Not away from the strike. Into the opening the strike created. He wasn't reacting to Saxon's movements. He was reacting to Saxon's intentions. Intercepting the plan before the execution. This, Saxon would later understand, was the core principle of Jeet Kune, the way of the intercepting fist. Not a defensive art. Not a counter-striking art. Something more unsettling than either. An art built around the idea that the optimal moment to defeat an attack is before it fully exists. But understanding the concept did nothing to help Saxon deal with it in real time. He described the experience as fighting a ghost who could hit you with a sledgehammer. The ghost part he could feel, the intangibility, the refusal to be where Saxon's technique expected him to be. The sledgehammer part he felt in the occasions when Bruce chose to make contact. Light taps, controlled touches at the point of maximum vulnerability, delivered with enough intention that Saxon understood, without any ambiguity, exactly what they represented. Each tap was a message. That was your collarbone. That was your temple. That was your liver. And the most chilling part? Bruce was talking the entire time. Explaining. Teaching. Pointing out the gaps in Saxon's guard not with aggression, but with the patient clarity of a professor who found the subject genuinely fascinating. The ghost who hit like a sledgehammer was also, simultaneously, giving a lecture. Saxon said these sessions produced in him an emotion he hadn't felt since his earliest days in Nishiyama's dojo. Genuine humility. Not the performed humility of a student in front of a master. The involuntary humility that arrives when you realize the scale of what you don't know. He was a black belt. He was a legitimate fighter. He had worked his way through dojos where nobody cared about his career and everything cared about whether you could endure. and in 10 minutes of casual sparring on a Hong Kong film set. Bruce Lee made all of it feel like the first chapter of a book that had 1,000 more pages. Let me be direct with you for a second. We've heard martial arts stories before. We've heard legends before. The internet is full of tributes from people who never threw a punch in their lives describing Bruce Lee in terms that sound more like religion than biography. John Saxon is not that. He is a man who earned black belts in 2 separate disciplines under masters who had no patience for myth building. He is a man who spent years in genuine contact with genuine fighters and developed the technical vocabulary to tell the difference between performance and lethality. And what he said consistently across decades in rare and unguarded moments is that Bruce Lee was not performing. But the moment that finally proved it beyond any possible rationalization, it hadn't happened yet on that set. It was coming. And when it came without warning, without choreography, and with consequences that nobody on the crew was prepared for. The final tournament sequence of Enter the Dragon required Bruce to execute a sidekick against a shield held by a stuntman. Not an actor. A professional stuntman, one of the hardened, experienced men who absorb real force for a living and whose entire career is built on the ability to take a hit and stay functional. The shield was reinforced. Thick, layered padding, the kind of apparatus designed to absorb the kind of force a professional baseball player generates on a full swing. The stuntman had held that shield through hundreds of takes with hundreds of fighters. The director called action. Bruce stepped into the kick. And for one fraction of 1 second, a slip, a misalignment, a momentary failure of the extraordinary calibration Bruce maintained between his cinematic self and his actual self, the real power came through. The stuntman didn't fall. The stuntman was launched. 10 feet of airborne, arms out, completely involuntary flight before he crashed into a group of extras who had absolutely no idea that the background of this shot was about to become a disaster zone. The reinforced shield, the one built to absorb baseball bat impacts, had cracked in half. The stuntman's arm was broken. Instantly. Not from the direct kick. From the force traveling through the shield and through his bracing muscles and into the bone beneath. The pad had functioned exactly as designed. It had absorbed the force. It had absorbed it so completely that the energy had nowhere to go except into the man holding it. The set froze. Bruce was immediately out of character, rushing to the man, apologizing with what Saxon and everyone else present described as genuine distress. Bruce Lee, who spent his career demonstrating that the most advanced martial artists are those who never have to use their skills in earnest, was visibly horrified by what an accidental slip of control had produced. Saxon didn't move. He stood there looking at the cracked shield and listening to the groaning stuntman and running a single calculation through his trained fighter's mind. The shield was designed to stop a baseball bat. A baseball bat, swung at full extension by a professional, generates somewhere between 50 and 80 pounds of peak impact force. The shield had cracked. Saxon said that in that moment, he stopped thinking about Bruce Lee as a martial artist. He started thinking about him as something for which the existing vocabulary was simply inadequate. He wasn't fast. He wasn't strong. He was something that produced physical outcomes that the materials around him were not engineered to accommodate. He said, "Television can't show you the heaviness of it. You can't transmit what it felt like to be in that room and understand what you were looking at." Here is why John Saxon's account matters more than any other testimony about Bruce Lee's power, and why it's worth spending this much time on a conversation that ended in 2020 when Saxon passed away. Most witnesses to Bruce Lee's abilities were not equipped to evaluate them. Fans bring reverence. Critics bring skepticism. Neither produces reliable testimony. What produces reliable testimony is expertise, the technical background to understand what you're actually looking at. John Saxon brought that expertise. He understood hip mechanics, weight transfer, kinetic chain efficiency, the difference between trained power and generated force. He could have watched Bruce Lee and said, "Impressive technique, smart mechanics, good timing." And that would have been a credible, educated assessment. Instead, he came away saying that none of his training vocabulary was sufficient to explain what he witnessed. That the cracked shield was not a product of technique. That the stuntman's flight was not a product of mass or momentum in any configuration his education had prepared him for. That's not reverence. That's a trained analyst hitting the edge of his analytical tools. Bruce Lee's conversations with Saxon between takes reveal something else. A mind that was as relentless as the body. Bruce would explain that Jeet Kune wasn't a style. It was a subtraction process. Every traditional form you learn, every structured kata, every codified system, it adds vocabulary, but it also adds obligation. You become responsible for defending the system. Jeet Kune, in Bruce's articulation, was the practice of removing everything until only what was functional remained. Not a philosophy, a precision tool. Saxon found this deeply challenging. His entire foundation was formal structure. Nishiyama had built his body and his confidence through the rigidity of Shotokan. The idea that the structure itself was a limitation, that the kata he had bled for was simultaneously his greatest asset and his greatest constraint, was genuinely destabilizing. But after 10 minutes of trying to tag Bruce in an open dojo and landing nothing, he couldn't argue with the conclusion. The ghost who hit like a sledgehammer had made its point. In his later years, John Saxon retreated from the public life he had navigated with such intensity for 6 decades. He and his wife Gloria settled in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. The conventions became rarer. The interviews became shorter. The co-stars kept disappearing. Bruce in 1973. Jim Kelly in 2013. Others along the way. Saxon was becoming the last man standing. The final living container for memories that were otherwise gone. He maintained a physical practice until the end. Not training in any competitive sense, but the breathing exercises Nishiyama had taught him. The fundamental body awareness that martial arts installs, and that, once installed, never fully leaves. He was in his 80s, moving through the same principles he had first encountered in a Brooklyn kid's body, before the name change, before Hollywood, before Hong Kong. On July 25, 2020, John Saxon, born Carmine Rico, Bay Ridge, Brooklyn, 1936, died of pneumonia at 83 years old. The tributes came from 2 worlds simultaneously. The film community mourned an actor of formidable range and unbreakable discipline. The martial arts community mourned something rarer, a legitimate practitioner who had stood close enough to the greatest of all time to feel the air move. What Saxon left behind isn't just a collection of stories. It's a calibrated witness statement from a man with the technical background to understand what he was seeing and the personal integrity to spend 47 years not exaggerating it, not mythologizing it, and not diminishing it, just reporting it. That is the difference between hitting a target and destroying it. He heard that sentence in a gym in Bel Air in 1972. He spent the rest of his life understanding what it meant. The debate about Bruce Lee always comes back to the same question. Was he real? And what's frustrating about that question is how easily it gets answered with mythology. Either the mythology of the believers or the mythology of the skeptics. Both require you to ignore the evidence. Both require you to fill the gaps with what you already think. John Saxon didn't do that. He had too much training for comfortable mythology. He couldn't unsee what he'd seen, couldn't unknow what he knew, couldn't pretend that a cracked shield and a man flying 10 feet through the air was choreography. He just reported it. Quietly. Consistently. Without embellishment. For 47 years. And if you can't trust the testimony of a legitimate black belt who was standing close enough to hear the air crack, who can you trust? Think about that. If this video changed the way you see John Saxon or Bruce Lee, drop it in the comments. And if you want to go deeper into the real history behind the legends that Hollywood built on top of genuine warriors, subscribe. The next video is already waiting for you.